by the meeting of minds have illuminated the world. Will we advance as one, or will we travel alone?
This was just one of a bewildering series of inventions which were changing the habits of the people.
What is the true cost of a tech war? Welcome, everyone. My name is Shirley Yu. Today, joining me is Jim Rogers, American investor. Well, making money is kind of boring already, so he became a best-selling author. Alicia Garcia Herrero, chief economist for APAC Natixis. Andy Mok, senior research fellow at the Chinese think tank Center for China and Globalization.
Oops.
Welcome, everyone. Now, let's unpack the title, The True Cost of a Tech War, a little bit here. What is the difference between tech competition and the tech war? What makes you, gentlemen and ladies, to believe that this is a war rather than a long, sustainable, fierce competition?
Well, I will tell you that this is Jim Rogers, throughout history, when things go wrong in a country, politicians blame the foreigners. The foreigners have different language, skin, religion, food, everything. And so it's easy to blame the foreigners. And politicians all over the world throughout history blame the foreigners. And that's what America started doing. Mr. Trump loved to blame the foreigners. China was somewhat restrained for a while, but now China's joined in, and nobody has ever won a trade war. Trade wars are not good for anybody.
What is the fine line there, Jim, and everyone, between competition and war? Why do you call it a tech war?
Well,
I think one of the different.
Go ahead, Andy.
Oh, go ahead, Jim. Oh.
No, Andy, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'd say one of the big differences between a competition and a war is just the intention of destructiveness. So in a competition, each side, if there's two sides, or there can be more than two sides, are playing to win. But I think it's clear, I think as Jim alluded to, is what the U.S. initiated is a tech war, and not just a trade war, but a tech war. And what this means is that the U.S. is looking to inflict damage on China. And I think this is not just bad for China, it's bad for the world. And ironically, it's also bad for the US, which I'm sure we'll talk more about as to why that is.
Okay, so it's basically based on a scale of devastation here. So let's talk about the true cost a little bit. There have been 8 waves of tech wars in China alone over the past decade, from the Groupon's war in 2012 to the ride-hailing war, to the Fintech war, to the shared bikes war, and now fiercely into the NEV war. Chinese tech, there is no way that Chinese tech would have risen so fast had there not been this 8 waves of wars in the past decade. And so today, why are we so focused on the cost of a tech war rather than the benefit of a tech war?
Well, I want to interrupt again. There are not many benefits of a trade war. Yes, some people do very well from a trade war, but it's a small number of people, and most of the people in that country and in the world suffer from a trade war. And sometimes, of course, trade wars turn into shooting wars, where they're shooting real bullets at each other. Nobody wins a trade war. Countries that think they win the trade war, they fall behind technologically, they fall behind in economics, they fall behind in everything. While they think they're winning, and some people are spending a lot of money at the golf club, most people in the country are suffering.
Yeah, I think it's strange to use the term war when you come to technology, because the declaration of war is coming from some quarters, but not others. I think the whole tech supply chain and the history of tech and globalization, which I witnessed for 30 years at Philips Electronics. I was chief trade lawyer there for 20 years. And what I've seen there is a happy period of globalization where everybody benefits. The competition, the strong competitive forces, the different waves of competition that you described have delivered amazing benefits to people all over the world. And it gives people access to technology. So I ask myself, and well, there are millions of people around the world asking, what's the point of a tech war where the aim is to have a win-lose configuration, whereas the whole technology industry business is predicated on win-win. It's all about cooperation. There's global innovation takes place 24/7 now, which wasn't possible before we had global connectivity. And there are global supply chains. You take examples. Smartphone might have 400 components coming from 24 countries. No
Sure.
country is going to win a tech war as you describe it. There are no winners. There are only losers.
Neither China or the United States. So it's interesting. So from both you and Jim are basically saying what there is going to be a win-lose. And so countries can win one another or each other. They just don't win the technological revolution in totality.
Well,
So
Well, Shirley,
in the end.
Yeah. Well, I've got a slightly different take to what Craig just said. That I think that the difference, first of all, between the Groupon wars, the bike sharing wars in China, is that the stakes are very high, as they are with the competition or the tech war between the US and China. But one of the differences is that the casualties in a war over shared bikes or over group buying or whatever we want to call it is really economic and just financial. It's the investors that are hurt at the end of the day. But in this tech war, real lives are being impacted. So I think this is one important difference to bear in mind. But the other point, though, is that wars do have winners. And I think this is an unfortunate geopolitical consequence, which Xi Jinping talks about, that we're witnessing changes unseen in a century or in a lifetime. And we are in this tectonic realignment where the US was top dog for decades. And now clearly, China, with the largest economy in purchasing power parity terms, increasingly a leader in important technologies like 5G, et cetera, that we hope, I hope, and I'm sure all of us hope, that we can have this realignment without a destructive war, but a more peaceful way of doing it. And I think that, to me, is the big question.
Healthy
how we
competition.
get there.
Well, right. So interestingly, we know now, we sort of agree that there is a tech war going on, but we are assuming that we also know who are waging the tech wars. The tech companies are certainly waging wars against one another, against their fellow tech companies. Governments are waging wars against tech companies, and governments are waging wars against their own domestic tech companies, as we see recently prominently in both the US and China. So it feels like this is a world of one against another and all against all. So when we talk about a tech war, how many sides are we even talking about here?
I think you exaggerate there, Shirley. You're telling the tech companies Huawei works with thousands of partners all over the world. Tech companies work on the basis of competition. And the markets between China and the US are deeply intertwined. There's a $440 billion semiconductor market out there. Yes, China imported in 2020 half of that. But what happens to that? It is then put into products which are then returned to the United States. 12 million iPhones, $100 million is what Qualcomm sells to China. And that's returned to the benefit of the rest of the world and to American consumers. But so there's healthy competition between tech companies, and no tech companies are asking for a tech war. There are only a few people in the US that are asking for a tech war. The rest of the community of technology companies is built on cooperation, shared innovation. 5G, you mentioned, American companies unfortunately missed out on in the competitive race to be superior in 5G, but 5G is actually shared between many technology companies. And we share access by cross-licensing. Huawei has, yes, we have lots of patents in 5G, but so does Ericsson and Nokia and Cisco and many other companies. And what do? We share access to that by paying each other fees. We paid $6 million last year. So it's a healthy competition inside the tech sector. It's not a war between tech companies, but there are others that seem to want to fight wars on different fronts.
Craig, you're exactly right, except for the fact that in the US, and I happen to be an American, in the US, some companies were behind. And so they went to Washington and said, oh, it's the evil Chinese. They're spying on us with 5G. We must protect us. And that's really no more than protectionism. Nothing to this. America's falling behind. China produces, 10 times as many engineers every year as America does, and America's falling behind. The way it's supposed to work is Okay, then you get better engineers and you compete and you beat them. Unfortunately, America says, let's go to the politicians instead of to the engineers.
Mm.
Well, what I
Shirley,
might add to that,
may
what
I
I
add
might add to that is that I think Jim makes an excellent point. So I did a recent video for CGTN looking at this tech war. And I think the issue here that the US is thinking about this like a boxing match and trying to knock China out. Whereas I think the better way of thinking about it is as a marathon, where the US should work on its own capabilities, its own stamina, its own discipline, and try to outrun China versus trying to knock China out or kneecap China. Because again, I think as Craig alluded to, one of the big issues is that trade is not simple in today's world. It's not one country selling to another. But when we look at complex technological products in particular, the supply chain stretches around the world. Parts can go to 5, 6, 10 different countries before they reach its ultimate consumer. So this is a very, very complex ecosystem. And I think it's really self-defeating to think of it as a war or as this kind of destructive kind of competition.
Mm. Before we get into supply chains, there is certainly severe consequences there. Let's get some basics right here. Who is the cause of this wave of tech war here?
May I say something?
Alicia,
Yeah,
please
Shirley.
go ahead. Feel free to jump in whenever, please.
Speak, Alicia, speak.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah, that's fine. So first of all, I think, if we follow our argument, probably our listeners may be confused because it's quite simple. Companies do not want to compete. They love working with each other, apparently. Governments are, the problem. Yeah, people are suffering from trade war, tech war. Why are they then choosing these governments? I think that's too simple. To be frank, as an economist, I fully agree that both a trade war and a tech war are harmful, no doubt about it. We all know that. But this is in absolute terms. The point is, here is geoeconomics, it's relative terms. It's about who loses the most. And this is really a chess game. One thinks the US that China will lose most, and China probably thinks the US will lose the most because of the reason Jim just mentioned. Yeah, they have more engineers, but maybe that's not all. Maybe engineers will make the difference. So the point here is knowing whether a tech war is relatively better for one or the other. That's the key issue. And I think that's what these two governments are working on. And that's why we're there. And their citizens may actually agree with the governments. If you ask anybody around in China or the US, that's where we are. So it's not so simple, unfortunately.
Right. So I would imagine all rational governments would understand if countries work with each other, technology revolutionizes much faster, but they much rather win out against another government than having that total global welfare, so to speak. So now, Craig, you commissioned a report following Alicia's comment here from the EIU. According to the EIU intelligence report, the base case scenario for a US-China full decoupling points to $52 trillion of GDP loss globally in the current decade. That's a lot. That's almost 4 times of Chinese GDP currently. But in that report, very interestingly, it says that China suffers the most in a full decoupling scenario with an aggregate 16 points or 16% GDP decline over the current decade. So if your report holds true, Craig, a full decoupling hurts China the most. Why so?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's not my report, but it's a report made by the Economist Intelligence Unit, which is well-respected, and they took on the task. When I conceived that report at the beginning of last year, the idea was to have some facts on the table that we could talk about numbers. You've picked on one very small point, but I think what the real issue that's behind that EIU report on the cost of deglobalization, which is available on the Economist website. The real message behind that is that an aggressive decoupling will result in a loss of welfare of, as you say, $52 trillion over the next 10 years. I mean, that's very difficult to understand, but put that in context, that's the equivalent of Japan's economy being shut down every year for the next 10 years, right? And that will have massive effects on everyone. Every country, practically every country suffers. And there are plenty of figures that I'm not going to bore with figures, but in the EIU report, there's plenty to see in that. The message from that report is that everyone suffers and every consumer is going to suffer from an aggressive form of decoupling. So that's what's the basis, and that's the key message in that EIU report.
However, Craig, I do want to go.
Oh, Shirley, if I can just jump in, I want to go back and elaborate a little bit on what Alicia said, that I completely agree that this is broader than just economics, but it's, I would say, even broader than geoeconomics. And the cause of this conflict is really a very profound difference in worldview. So the U.S. subscribes to this Western way of thinking, a very realist way of thinking, where countries live in a state of anarchy. And if the U.S. cannot be top dog technologically, economically, militarily, it's at risk. Now, China has a much more classical, we could call it a Confucian approach of this yi-duobu fen, which just means the one and the many are inseparable, and sees that we're all part of an ecosystem and we have to coexist. The US is like maybe the stomach, China's like the heart, and we all have to work together, not in some rhetorical sense, but in a very, very literal sense. And I think this is the root cause of this conflict, that the US feels threatened and feels it needs to do something. And the question is, what do we all do about it? And it's not just the magnitude of the economic losses that Craig talked about in the EIU report, but we also have to think about all of these other intangibles. It's not China, it's not just the US. I was just on a call last night with a number of people actually based in Singapore from IISS. And there's a lot of concern in Southeast Asia, other parts of the world too, about this tech war, because there will be collateral damage. There is collateral damage. So the question is, how do we mitigate that to the degree we can?
You say China is the heart, but just recently from the Wendy Sherman's visit in Tianjin, we see fire everywhere, right? China's foreign minister was quite outspoken, and previously and afterwards, China's foreign minister Wang Yi was very, I should say, quite assertive as well. So in this U.S.-China take war scenario here, China would go 100%, and I would say go 500% for a take war instead of a take concession to the United States. I don't see a take concession scenario. Is there any chance that China wouldn't want to fight a take war out with the United States now?
I don't know if anyone else wants to address that.
I would just like to say, I don't know why anybody would want to do a trade war unless you're the one being protected. If you're Apple, you want a trade war because you're being protected, but nobody else wants a trade war. No consumer wants it. No supplier wants it. Nobody. I mean, if we had trade wars when radio was invented, we'd still have radio in 3 countries. When automobiles, we'd have automobiles in 4 or 5 countries. Is that good for the world? I don't think so. And likewise for anything else that's coming along. Trade wars, to repeat myself, are not good for anybody except the people being protected. And they usually have the money to go to Washington or Beijing or London or wherever and say, evil foreigners, hit them in the face. I will say that at least for a while, Beijing was much more restrained, but now I see even Beijing getting involved with it. If I were Beijing, and I'm not, but I would say, okay, you go ahead and do it, America. You go ahead and have all the trade wars you want. We're going to sit here and have open borders and open trade, and we'll see in 10 years or 30 years or 50 years.
I think you're right, absolutely right, Jim. You put your finger on that key point. I mean, we have just thousands and thousands of pages of evidence that trade wars fail. It's not even in the recent past. They have failed over the last many, many thousands of years. I mean, we took China's 5,000 years, and there's evidence of civilization 10,000, 100,000 years. America is a 250-year-old economy. But all throughout history, we have seen that trade wars just do not work. They have repercussions back on those that start them. But I wanted to mention two things which I think are really interesting, and that is not just the EIU report, but if you read the Boston Consulting Group, they read a report last year about the semiconductor industry. And as Andy was saying, it's not just monetary terms, monetary loss, but their headline message was a trade war will lose the United States its advantage in semiconductor technology, leading to South Korea becoming the #1 in semiconductors, which would be followed in a few years later by China becoming #1. And then they point to lots of figures about the loss in market share, but I wanted to highlight one important, the danger, the risk of this strategy creates a downward spiral. If you can't make profit and your market share dwindles, your profits dwindle, and you can't put money back into research and development, so you start to lose. And when you go into the next cycle, you become diminished into the next cycle, so you're weaker. And that results over a period of time, 2 or 3 cycles, that can result in you losing the entire technical edge without open global markets, fair competition, and open access and non-discrimination. Those are the principles that the US signed up to together with all members of the WTO, or the GATT as it was in 1947. But that's what the last 70 years, those rules have enabled enormous growth in world prosperity and in practical elimination of poverty in many, many, many countries. It's a global good, so why would we want to engage in a damaging process that undermines what globalization and free trade of markets has achieved over those 70 years? History is not in favor of, always not aligned with some of the movements that
I want to, Alicia, let me just jump in. Craig, the main lesson of history is people do not learn the lessons of history. You and I can tell, look, this is what history shows. And people will say, history, who cares? I'm smarter than history. Who cares about history? Well, I know that I am not smarter than history. Go ahead, Alicia.
This time it's different.
Well, I just wanted to say that if we follow Craig's argument, then I'm sorry, but the report you commissioned is wrong, because China would be the winner of this tech war, wouldn't it? And that's, in a way, pushing that argument. One could think that, well, let's take this tech war. That will just make China stronger. That will make its semiconductor sector stronger. Let's go for it. Why fight it? And that's a dangerous statement in the sense that I think, frankly speaking, nobody can estimate who will win, who will lose, how much. I mean, everybody will lose. I fully agree with that, but in relative terms. And that's the problem, because it's a dynamic process, because we are assuming, and I think we have evidence of that, RCEP, you know, the agreement, investment agreement with Europe, although it might not go through. But the point is, we could argue that China has responded so far by opening. But it might change. We're seeing, and I quite agree with Shirley, quite worrisome statements lately, which could end up, you know, basically going somewhere else rather than that direction. So we don't really know. That's the problem, because if we knew, we might not be so worried about the tech war, or at least China should not be so worried about the tech war.
Well, picking up on your point, Alicia, is rather interesting. You also showed me an IMF report. So we are just basically assuming here, right, what's going to be the base case scenario for a tech war. Nobody has ever experienced this before in the history of the world. I mean, IMF shows different assumptions, BCG shows different assumptions, and I'm not going to lie about it. EIU did show that China is the biggest loss carrier, which is sad. I mean, the assumptions are showing different case scenarios, but let's just go back to a very interesting point that we are all talking about here. for the rest of the world outside of the US and China, if we are talking about one global trading world, what are the best options for them?
Sorry, could you say that? I didn't catch that question.
So outside of China and the US, now clearly the two countries are competing in the trade war. What about the rest of the countries? What is the best thing for them to do?
Stay out of it. There's no reason to get, if America and China want to have a trade war, let them do it. But why would Brazil or Germany or anybody else get into it? They will benefit if they stay open and if they get the benefit of all those engineers. It's very simple for me. Let them have their trade war. Let's stay out of it and be the beneficiary.
I think another part of this I think another part of this is that for many countries, hedging, of course, is very important. So just being careful not to be caught in the crossfire. But I think the other thing, too, is there are opportunities for them to act, for lack of a better word, and I don't mean this in a negative way, opportunistically. So look at Germany. The U.S. was dead set against Nord Stream 2. And this was an enormous irritant for the Germans. But magically, somehow, the U.S. has now decided it's okay. And, the reason is not too surprising because I think the Biden administration is looking to repair relations with Germany so they can build, hopefully, this coalition to counter China. But, I think of this as Biden is playing Don Quixote and is looking for his loyal but dim-witted followers to go charging at these windmills. But that is, I think, part of the win here for these countries in the middle.
Dim-witted followers. Well, let's, Alicia, let me go back to you. You said to me earlier that countries, from your analysis, other than the US and China, they will lose if they decide to join one or the other take or trade orbits. So I guess the most rational thing for countries to do, other than China and the United States, should join both orbits at the same time. So countries are sovereign and they are free agents. And why is it so hard to do both?
It is very hard, especially if you are a smaller country. I mean, I think for the European Union, and this is what Europe is trying to do, basically some kind of economic sovereignty. We're not sovereign as a union, as you all know. We're not a nation, but at least economic sovereignty to indeed try to stay neutral and benefit. But it's very, very hard because there will be forces in both directions. So just think about Germany. I mean, it's basically the US and China are about the same for Europe. Actually, we export more to the US than to China, but we import more from China than from the US. So both are our largest trading partners outside of the EU itself. So what to do? I mean, it is very hard to stay neutral, even for a region as big as Europe. I think the UK, to be frank, has already taken sides. It's very obvious in its recent kind of, very much towards the US. And I think many more countries will have to, because there's also a question of standards. Standards are key. I think we will end up with two ecosystems with two different standards. It will be very expensive for a small country to stay within two different ecosystems. That's why I think many won't have that option. Maybe Europe will, but it's a big question mark.
I think that's a really good point about the standards, because the benefits of standards agreed at a top level. I mean, technology really belongs to humankind. It's an achievement of mankind to have developed something that we put the label on 5G. I remember traveling in the 90s when 3G was around. I used to have 3 or 4 or 5 phones. I had one for Japan, 2 for America, because there were different standards on East Coast and West Coast. But I had one phone for the European Union because the Commission mandated, let's have GSM from Finland to Portugal, so that all countries in Europe, no matter what language you're speaking, we can all connect and communicate to each other. That was what Europe did for all the citizens of Europe in the 1990s. 5G is a family of standards which allows a very, very high performing level of communication with vast data flows, which we need when we're moving to more and more visuals and gaming and all of the technology and blockchain. They all require a lot more bandwidth and fast up and download speed. 5G has been put together by the best minds across the whole world. And there are so many scientists across the world that have put there. And we've created a family of standards. Are you seriously telling me that we should go to the next generation and have a 6G Western Hemisphere and a 6G Eastern Hemisphere? It's ludicrous.
But I would certainly have to confirm with. I said before, everybody just stay out of the trade war and go with the best guys. We don't have 5 telephones anymore. We only have 1 telephone. So is the world better off with 5 telephones in our pockets or 1 telephone in our pocket?
And it becomes more expensive to have those 5 telephones because each one will cost so much more if you don't have the economies of scale and the efficiencies of global supply chains. It's really a no-brainer, Alicia.
Well, the point I'd like to add to this too. Oh, please go ahead, Alicia.
I fully agree. Don't take me wrong. I fully agree. I'm just saying that you're looking at things basically on a not on a relative basis, and not everybody is convinced. Politicians aren't, and voters might not be either. It's all about fear. I mean, they may value their fear more than their phones. We don't really know. That's why this is happening. We can't only think it's rational.
Wait, Alicia, what's the fear? What are we afraid of?
I'm not, but people might. People might be afraid of, as you said it already, Jim, or foreigners, both sides, by the way.
Yeah. No, America
That's
says
it. And by the way, COVID is not helping. We don't have cross-border mobility. This is a huge problem because people can't meet, and fear will only increase over time. So I'm not saying it's good. I'm saying that it might not be as crazy or as irrational. It's just it's humanity. I think it has huge costs. I fully agree, but I'm just saying that we need to understand that not everything that happens is just crazy. If it happens, there might be reasons why it's happening. We may not agree with them. I do not agree as an economist. I think this is massively costly, but I just can't dismiss it because it's happening. So I better understand why it's happening.
Yeah, I think you're looking too much emphasis on the emotional side of the discussion, although that is a very important component. I mean, those that feel left out of globalization are the people that feel that they haven't had a fair share of the distribution of its benefits. So probably rather than tech war, the single most pressing problem for the world, of course, climate, the planet being on fire is number one. But very close behind is inequality, because that is driving the justified unhappiness of many people who feel that they've left out on globalization. Globalization and free trade are forces for good, but they've been undermined by human activity. Let me quickly say, it is possible with global collaboration to work together to shape the direction that globalization takes. In the last 3 decades, we have had multilateral agreements such as the 96 ITA agreement, which put 0 tariffs on electronic hardware. The US tech companies were behind this idea. It was a great idea. And they came to Philips and all the European countries and said, what about this? Why don't we go for 0? Because that means everybody will have access. There'll be technology for all. So we all got together and the governments agreed to reduce the tariffs to 0. That resulted in an enormous boost to the distribution of technology around the world, to all the corners. All the tech companies, I think we can all be really proud that we've delivered smartphones into the hands of billions of people. And in many countries around the world, people now have access to communications where previously they had no fixed line, very little electricity, and the technology has delivered the ability to do that. But the other thing, we have shaped it because we have undergone rounds of global agreement through the multilateral system. We've had global agreements for trade liberalization. There's been an explosion of interest in the internet. All of this has happened because of the human desire for communication. And all of these forces have been guided by the way responsible governments around the world have looked at trade liberalization and globalization as a whole. The disenchantment with globalization is recent, and it's due in the last, sort of 10 years. But that disillusionment is due to the fact that people, due to inequality, people that don't feel they're getting the benefits from it.
But I think a little bit
glad.
of that.
Oh, I just want to say, I'm really glad, Craig, you mentioned this question of inequality, because I think, of course, inequality is a huge political issue. But if we look at it from a global digital inclusion perspective, lowering cost is vital. So lowering cost, of course, is important to investors because it increases company valuations. It's important for companies. It's important for developed world consumers. But we also need to remember there still are billions of people that have been literally left out because they can't afford the actual hardware of the smartphone. And the other point I want to mention about this is we're also in a world where digital inclusion and financial inclusion are rapidly converging. So look at China's launch of the digital yuan, or the DCEP, the digital currency electronic payment. That also is a revolutionary technology that will allow not just the unbanked in China, but the unbanked around the world to join the financial world at a much, much lower cost. So I think these two developments are very, very important, and I think reinforce this idea that to the extent we can, if we have one set of standards, we can maximize economies of scale in manufacturing, that it really is very, very important beyond just China and the United States.
But
And I
Andy,
would
it's not,
say technology solves the climate issue as well, because China produces 70% of global solar. 7 of the top 10 wind turbine companies are Chinese, and 1/3 of Chinese SOEs are currently engaged in hydrogen. And so it is fundamentally technology. I'm sorry, Jim.
no, I was just going to say, Andy, it's not going to work if everybody has, if there are 14,000 currencies out there, and 14,000 different internet kinds of money. That's not going to work. The only thing that's going to work is like the telephones. We all can use, I can call anywhere in the world on my telephone. There's no different now in 2021. But if we all had to have 6 different phones or 8 phones or whatever the number poor Craig had to have, that's not going to work. The only way that's going to work is we have a single monetary system. Now, everybody has to open up. China's not open yet. They're opening, but everybody has to play in the same game or it won't work.
However,
I think it's very interesting to see what's going on in Asia, actually. I mean, we've talked about, a tech war between the giants, but I thought the regional cooperation agreement, which was signed last November by the countries of ASEAN, is very significant, and it didn't get very much press in the West, and I think that's a mistake, because 1/3 of the world's population in that region, accounting for 1/3 of the world's GDP, have come together to say, we want interdependence between our economies, we want connected supply chains, and we want collaboration. And those are the words of the Prime Minister of Singapore at the signing. The fact that, and there are other parts of the world that want to have interdependence, a balanced independence and a balance of dependencies and interdependencies. But the example of RCEP is a remarkable coming together of governments and peoples in favor of a regional free trade agreement and in favor of open markets. It's interesting that a large number there are polls which give you numbers, I forget them, but they will say that there's far more belief in trade liberalization and globalization in Asia as a motor for improving people's living standards and raising their income and delivering prosperity. Maybe in the Western world, we've become used to quite high standards of living, but I say that should be shared, and I think that should be and that's my personal view is that, and I've worked through this for all the companies I work for, my mission has been to apply the trade principles I've learned so that more and more people have access to technology. And so technology for all is something that Huawei is very proudly promoting. And I'm proud to be part of a company that's promoting technology for all. And I think that's the direction we need to be going to. It's not just about competition. Today, it's about something much more important. Sharing technology is about controlling COVID, combating the climate crisis, and building an inclusive recovery. And that's where supply chains and that's where technology is driving. And that's where I think we should encourage it to go.
I'm really glad you talked about the RCEP. And it's truly remarkable because it also brings China and Japan and South Korea together into a regional trading deal.
That's right.
So now, there is
a very significant achievement.
Remarkable. Not only RCEP, we also are talking about revival of the CPTPP. There is just the newly culminated Africa Free Trade Agreement, and there is certainly the EU. So look, regionalism has essentially superseded globalism. We have been in this world, and it didn't start from yesterday. Why can't we just be a little realistic about it and say the world is carved into different regional blocks, and there will be regional-based supply chains, and that's the reality of the world, and it's going to go like that and get stronger possibly.
Well, the reason we can't say it is it's not true. It's not. Globalization is a process that's been taking place for 100,000 years. It's about the exchange of ideas, goods, and services between people within my family, and then my tribe, and then my village, and then my city, and then my nation, and then it becomes humankind and globalization. If we drive in the direction of regionalization, it's because some regions think that that's a more effective way of making progress, but ultimately we will be on the path of globalization will resume. The question today is whether we want to waste our time, money, and effort, and energy, and livelihoods on divergence, when global collaboration and moving to promote globalization is the most effective way to go forward, and it's the one that brings the most benefits to the most.
Right.
Well, Shirley, I would say, but I would just say that these are not mutually exclusive. So that we certainly are witnessing greater regionalization, but that doesn't preclude globalization, meaning much broader concept. But I think what this says to me is that what this says to me is that China has been a force for centripetal force, meaning that it's pulling things together to coalesce. Whereas the US recently has really been a force for centrifugal force, meaning forcing things apart. And I think that where we can see this going is that with RCEP, SCO, these other types of regional organizations, that the Eurasian landmass, including Africa, really is becoming very, very integrated. And the US, if it continues down this path, I think is going to be left on the outside.
You're exactly right about that, but India is certainly not a paragon of free trade. Even China. I mean, I cannot contact you on Zoom in China. I don't know why I cannot, but I mean, China too is not as open as I would have it. Nobody is, of course. I would have everybody completely open, but that's a different problem.
Jim, we can do a Zoom call. I'm in Beijing. After our call today, or our online event today, we can do a Zoom call.
Hooray.
You need a VPN, but it's certainly possible. I do it all the time.
Can we do Skype?
We can do Skype.
Oh my gosh, hooray, hooray, hooray.
Yes.
This is progress, Jim. This is progress and opening up. You're a big fan, I know. You'll like it.
Opening up with Chinese characteristics.
The other thing, you're talking about opening up. Since 2013 in China, we've been able to pay with barcodes. One of the things that struck me when I came here, 2.5 years ago, I rarely touch my wallet, if at all. I mean, everything goes through my smartphone. The payment fintech that we have makes my life so much easier. It's incredible. You won't believe it. I can pay for everything using QR codes. In fact, it is so prevalent that even buskers in the metro that are collecting money will have printed out a QR code on a bit of paper, and they'll have that over their neck, and you scan it and you make your donation. It's all over China, and that is because China has leaped over the old-fashioned credit cards. That was a technology of the 1960s. Do you remember the cassette tapes? I can remember cassette tapes. And that was the magnetic strip on the back of a credit card. Why are we still using those? It's only in recent years that the big card companies have moved into putting chips inside the code, inside the cards. But China's already way ahead when it comes to fintech. With my WeChat app, I can pay for anything, anywhere. The smallest traders in the most remote villages. That's progress.
There is no question.
And Craig,
you're exactly right. You cannot take a taxi in China with money. You have to use your phone money. China's way ahead of the rest of us.
And you
that
pay
does
with
not
the
mean that
QR
China's not as open as I would have. Nobody's as open as I would have.
But Craig, also what's very important to point out here is this is not just a game for consumers, but when you think about small businesses that might have to pay 2-3% to a payment processor that they don't have to pay when they use WeChat or Alipay. When you think about the elimination of friction, collecting the money, having the cash register, a cashier, taking the money to the bank, these are fairly invisible, but very, very powerful efficiency gains that, to me, also indicate why China is going to win. If there is a tech war that continues to its bitter end, I think that China will win just because it has these not so visible advantages that if you're sitting, thousands of miles away in London or New York or DC, that you would completely miss. But Jim, as you know, if you've been in China, it's actually pretty obvious.
Oh yeah,
So let me go back to you, Craig. Let me go back to you. So it's interesting you are talking about the fintech revolution in China, which is essentially creating a whole new court for tech competition. But for the 5G infrastructure technology for Huawei, we are assuming that we are on this 5G, 6G, 7G race, and companies should be better, faster, stronger. But then you have companies in the US like Starlink that's putting satellites all over the world. And I think it's coming to operation at the end of the year, isn't it? I mean, that's about technological revolution of creating a whole new court for race altogether. How serious is it? I want to hear your inside opinions.
On Starlink? So I think Elon Musk is an incredible entrepreneur, and I think that is an amazing project. I'd like to go back in time and look at what US sanctions in the year 2000 did to the US satellite industry. It's a very interesting study, and I'm glad you raised it. There was a study by the US Air Force Research Department which showed that when the US put export controls on satellite technology, it resulted in the United States losing $2.4 billion in foreign sales over during the 2000 to 2008. And it also showed that countries around the world went for designing out of US technology because of the restrictions placed by the US on exports of their technology. Mm-hmm. So the advance that the US has today in satellite or rocket technology, it could have been so much more. But the restrictions used, the extraterritoriality and the sanctions placed by the ITAR arrangement, there are countless, if you read that report, it's a really good one. It shows that the annual cost was something like $588 million of lost sales, and it's about lost market share. And it also produced 4 different types of global positioning system. The American GPS, but the Russian Glasnost, the Chinese Baidu now, and European Galileo, which are all superior technologies. So, satellite is one example. As I said, the Air Force research in the US points out the cost of closing your market and not sharing technology is extremely costly, and you lose the edge.
But do you see Starlink as a genuine competitor for Huawei?
Starlink is a different technology, which is using satellites. 5G base stations and infrastructure, there's a lot of global competition in that. So I think the economics have yet to be proven for Starlink. I know Elon Musk wants to take it public and has started to put out advertisements that you can pay $99 and take a share in it. But I'm not sure, maybe you should ask Jim whether you would put, would you invest in that?
Would you bank in it?
Well, let me just go back because your point about the satellites, you know, when you close off, you lose, somebody loses. And America and everybody else has radio and everybody else has telephones. And so we can all expand and grow and come up with new technologies. Right now, there's some kids, 18-year-olds in a garage somewhere, coming up with who knows what. But the reason they can come up with who knows what is because it's open. It's open enough anyway. And your point about America losing because it closed off satellites is very, very telling. Doesn't matter what it is, whether it's shoes or boats or anything. That principle applies. And none of us can make all the governments open up, but if I were in charge, I would say everybody open up tomorrow afternoon.
At the close of trading. So Craig, very interestingly, you just mentioned from the satellite case, China today is not only a strategic competitor in technology, China is also the world's largest consumer market. And so when China is the market, the US companies have to invest 12, 14% in R&D per annum. And when they invest so much money in R&D, then when they lose the markets, then that disincentivizes R&D innovation, doesn't it?
Huawei is in the top 5.
In other words, American companies will be disincentivized to invest in R&D because they are losing the world's biggest export market. Would that rationale make sense?
Find some 18-year-olds and give them a garage.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Shirley, but I didn't really follow the logic of your argument, because if there, as Jim says, if we don't have barriers, then you recycle your investment. If you read the reports of the American Chamber of Commerce in China and also the European Chamber of Commerce in China, which collects the views from all companies that they're non-Chinese, but they are investing in China. And from my own conversations with many businessmen here in China from foreign-owned companies, none of them is telling me that they're walking out of China. No, none of them. Many of them are saying we're investing more. They're investing in the future because of this market. And so it's not a question of if you shut yourself off from the world in innovation and technology. Well, the point I made earlier about the vicious cycle is actually the argument made by the Boston Consulting Group, saying that US would lose its edge if it cut itself, or if it cuts global supply chains in the semiconductor industry, because they would not have the money to invest and stay ahead. But you don't need to ask me that. There are plenty of US semiconductor companies that will explain that to you and give you much more detail on it.
Right.
Craig, I've got an example for you that I'd love to get your thoughts on. I mean, it seems to me that Huawei would have been perfectly happy continuing to use Android, but because of the sanctions, that it had to accelerate the launch of Harmony, which is doing very, very well, creating an ecosystem of developers, now really creating a formidable competitor to Android globally. And I've got to think that, if you're Sundar Pichai, you're probably pretty unhappy about this. I mean, Android, in a sense, had a great thing going, and now, because of US government policy, has created a Chinese alternative.
I think that I'm glad you raised that. That gives me a chance to point out that Harmony is an operating system that is completely different from others, because it is designed from the bottom up to work in a world of the Internet of Things, where we have everything connected, devices, sensors, and you don't need to load a sensor that is controlling your central heating system with an operating system as heavy as the iOS or an Android. You don't need that. But with Harmony, and it allows you a very simple way of connecting sensors all over, and that's why it's going to be an enormous success. Again, if you look backwards, I remember when the iPhone came in 2007, that everybody was amazed by it, but it was what we call a closed system where you had to work within that system. And then Google decided, well, there needs to be competition in the operating system, so they invested in, and the world had Android, but that's still only 2 players. So it's a good thing to introduce competition by having a third operating system. And judging by the take-up, it's an open system. It is judging by the take-up, the number of app developers that are working on it. And remember, all those apps, they're not created by 1 or 2 companies. They're created by thousands of really fantastic young people, as Jim says. Those app developers can work on Harmony, and it'll work around the world. And it's much simpler. We need to think also in the future about the architecture of the internet, because the architecture of the internet was built on technology created in the 60s and even going back to the 50s and 40s, in fact. But it goes back, it's very old, it's antiquated, it's out. It's not really fit for the purpose of the world that's coming. And that's why we need new rules for the digital ecosystem. That's why in the future, we need to look at new ways of making that system work more efficiently for us. And we need competition in that. We need competition between operating systems. We need competition. And that's what the tech sector globally is up for. We're all up for strong, robust competition.
Well, the other aspect of this I would jump in very briefly on is cybersecurity. So what we've seen is a few years ago, the world crossed the Rubicon where Stuxnet was the first computer virus to actually do real world damage. And we've seen ransomware attacks, et cetera, that just show how challenging this is as well, that I think will take a coordinated global response to address this. But also, I think the other thing about Harmony, as you mentioned, Craig, well, you didn't mention, but you said that the internet is actually in some ways outdated because of security reasons. And if I'm not mistaken, one of the key features of Harmony that struck me as being very forward-leaning is that it's built on a microkernel, right, which is much more secure than previous operating systems like Windows or even like Android. So again, I think that this is a very important concern that I spend a lot of time looking at, covering technology and its impact on great power relations. But cybersecurity, I think, is another area that companies need to pay attention to, but also is a global problem.
Let's organize another session. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to have to close today's session.
Oh,
1 minute
please.
for each of you. Tell President Joe Biden and the President Xi Jinping, hey, stop fighting. It's not good for you. I trust they are listening in right now. Go ahead. 1 minute.
I can start.
Why everybody's so quiet? Alicia, go ahead.
I would say
I just would like, okay. Very quickly, Jim, I think we're going to say the very same thing. Both should open more. I'm not going to argue which should open in which degree, because this is, a question of, I guess, very subjective issue. I think both would need to open more to the world, show the way to the rest of the world. Then it would be much harder for countries like India to do what they do now. I think they both need to show the will and be more open. Thank you.
And I think the bottom line is that we all stand to gain far much more from global collaboration.
Here, here. I mean, Deng Xiaoping said you open the windows you get sunshine and fresh air. You get flies, but you get sunshine and fresh air, and the sunshine and fresh air are worth the flies.
Well, I'm going to end on maybe a more nuanced note in that I recognize how complex and difficult and painful some of these trade-offs can be between politics and economics. But I do hope that certainly on the US and even in Western Europe, that there is more of an openness to a traditional Chinese view of the world, that we're all part, in a very little way, part of one system, and we need each other to function well.
Very well said, Andy.
Thank you so much.
Hear, hear.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for tuning in.
Are we finished?
Do we hang up or?
So
The sparks created by the meeting of minds have illuminated the world. Will we advance as one, or will we travel alone?
This was just one of a bewildering series of inventions which were changing the habits of the people and the...
Must we always pull apart, or can we dream together?
Tell you whatever they do is in the line of duty.
Here's to a soft landing.
Unity will remain the engine of our progress and change what it means to be